March 12th, 2016. A frantic 911 call pierces the silence of a quiet Texas neighborhood. On the other end of the line, panic. A woman's voice, breathless, trembling, desperate. She says her daughter isn't breathing. She says she doesn't know what happened. She says it was an accident. Paramedics arrive within minutes. Inside the house, they find her, a 4-year-old girl, small, fragile, lifeless. Her tiny body is covered in bruises, old wounds and fresh ones, layered like a grotesque timeline of suffering. Her lips are split, her ribs, some healed, some newly broken, signs of restraint, signs of prolonged, unimaginable pain. And then, one chilling discovery. Her injuries didn't happen all at once. They happened over time, days, weeks, months, maybe longer. At first, the story is simple, or at least that's how they want it to seem. The mother, Jerry Quezada, tells police it was a terrible accident. Her boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer, says he wasn't even home when it happened. But the evidence? The evidence tells an entirely different story. And soon, the horrifying truth begins to unravel. What investigators would uncover in the days and weeks to follow wasn't just the tragic story of one little girl. It was a case that would expose a system riddled with failures, a case that would spark national outrage, a case that would force lawmakers to ask the hardest question of all: how many other children have we failed? This is not just a story of murder. It's a story of betrayal by the very people who were supposed to protect her. It's a story of a system that looked away, even when the warning signs were screaming. And perhaps most chilling of all, it's a story that could have been prevented. Tonight, we take you deep inside the tragic case of Leiliana Wright. We will uncover the horrifying abuse that led to her final breath, the people responsible, and the shocking revelations that emerged during the trial. We will hear from those who tried to save her and from those who let her down. We will examine the failures of child protective services and the laws that allowed her to slip through the cracks. But there is one more thing, a final twist that makes this case even more haunting. Because while justice was eventually served, one question remains unanswered to this day. How many more Leilianas are out there, suffering in silence, ignored until it's too late? Before she was a headline, before she was a case number, before she became a symbol of a broken system, Leiliana Wright was just a little girl with dreams, with laughter, with a life waiting to be lived. She was born on May 14th, 2011, in Grand Prairie, Texas. A perfect baby girl, tiny fingers, a button nose, and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. From the very beginning, Leiliana was different. She wasn't just another child lost in the shuffle. She had a spark, a light that everyone around her could see. She was a firecracker, full of energy, always dancing, always singing. That girl had a personality bigger than life. She loved to draw, she loved to dance, and she was full of life, until that life was stolen. But beneath the laughter there were shadows, tiny cracks in a fragile world, signs that if anyone had looked closely enough, might have foretold the tragedy to come. She missed school often. Sometimes she would show up in the same clothes from the day before. Sometimes she seemed tired, withdrawn. I remember seeing her outside playing alone, and sometimes she just looked sad. Jerry Quezada was no stranger to trouble. By the time she became a mother, she had already been tangled in a life of addiction, toxic relationships, and run-ins with the law. Her struggles with methamphetamine were well documented. So were the reports of neglect. And yet, time and time again, she was given another chance. The home was deemed safe at the time of our visit. No immediate risk to the child. No immediate risk. But risk was there, growing, waiting. But not everyone looked away. Brian McCarr, Leiliana's father, had been trying to save her. I knew she wasn't safe. I told them, I begged them, but they wouldn't listen. I just wanted to be her dad. I wanted to give her a good life. And now, I don't get that chance. Brian wasn't the only one who saw the danger. Elisa and Craig Clackley, Leiliana's grandparents, fought just as hard to bring her to safety. We called. We sent pictures. We reported everything we saw. But nothing changed. Nothing changed until it was too late. There were warnings, many warnings. In 2014, CPS received its first report about Leiliana. In 2015, another, and another, and another. Yet each time the case was either dismissed or closed with minimal follow-up. CPS had been to the house. They had seen her. They had let her stay. The system is overloaded. Too many cases, not enough workers. But that's not an excuse. We failed her. We failed her. By the time 2016 arrived, Leiliana Wright was living in a home filled with danger, and the people who could have saved her didn't. But no one knew just how dark things were about to get. No one knew that within weeks her fate would be sealed. Monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they live in plain sight, smiling, laughing, pretending to love, but behind closed door, they are something else entirely. In the case of Leiliana Wright, there were two monsters, one she should have been able to trust, her own mother, Jerry Quezada, and her mother's boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer. Jerry Quezada was a mother in name only. Her real loyalty was to her addiction. Her real priority, herself. She had been in and out of trouble for years, arrested multiple times, addicted to methamphetamine. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the red flags, the system still allowed her to keep custody of Leiliana. She wasn't just an addict. She was dangerous, violent, unstable. And when she met Charles Pfeiffer, everything got worse. Charles Pfeiffer was a predator disguised as an ordinary man, but his past told a different story, a story of violence, rage, and abuse. Suspect exhibited extreme aggression, history of physical altercations, potential risk to minors. Before Leiliana, before Jerry, Charles had already left destruction in his wake. Ex-girlfriends had accused him of abuse. Former friends had distanced themselves. But somehow, he always managed to slip through the cracks. He could be so charming, but when he snapped, he was terrifying. When Jerry Quezada met Charles Pfeiffer, it wasn't love. It was gasoline meeting fire, a toxic, violent storm waiting to consume everything in its path. He had a hold over her, but she wasn't innocent. She chose him. She let him into that house. She let him near her daughter. Together, they created a house of horrors, and at the center of it was Leiliana Wright. The warning signs were there. They were always there, but no one listened. Neighbors said, "I heard yelling. I heard things breaking. I wanted to call someone, but I didn't know if it was my place." It was everyone's place, but no one acted fast enough. CPS had been involved in Leiliana's life for years. They had reports of neglect. They had reports of drug abuse in the home. And yet, they closed the case. We're overworked, understaffed. We have to make judgment calls. But this was a mistake. Despite allegations of drug use and neglect, there was no immediate threat found in the home. No immediate threat, but within weeks, Leiliana would be gone. March 12th, 2016, the last day of Leiliana Wright's life, a day that should have been ordinary, a day that should have ended with bedtime stories and warm blankets. Instead, it ended in horror. Inside a small home in Grand Prairie, Texas, a 4-year-old girl was living through her final hours. But she wasn't playing with dolls. She wasn't coloring in a book. She was fighting for her life against the very people meant to protect her. The night before her death, Leiliana Wright was already battered, bruised and broken. Her tiny body bore the scars of a child who had lived in constant fear. And yet, the worst was still to come. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, had been high on heroin. Her boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer, had been drinking. And Leiliana had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The morning started with pain, more punishment, more suffering, but no one outside that house knew. No one could hear her cries. The child was restrained, force-fed, and violently struck multiple times over the course of several hours. What was her crime? In the eyes of Charles Pfeiffer, she had been disobedient. In reality, she was just a child who was about to experience unimaginable cruelty. For hours, Leiliana was tormented. She was tied up with belts, beaten with objects, anything within reach, a bamboo rod, a curtain rod, a belt. extensive blunt force trauma, multiple contusions, internal bleeding. Her body had taken all it could. Her 4-year-old frame could no longer withstand the cruelty. At some point, she simply stopped moving. She's not breathing. I don't know what happened. At 5:36 p.m., Jerry Quezada finally made the call, but it wasn't a call for help. It was a call of desperation, a cover-up already in motion. Is she responsive? No, she just collapsed. But the truth? The truth was so much darker. I've seen a lot of things, but this broke me. When paramedics arrived, they were met with a horrifying sight. Leiliana's body was bruised from head to toe. There were marks around her wrists. Her lips were split. Her stomach was bloated. Evidence of internal bleeding. The mother was frantic, but something felt off. Because this wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just an accident. This was murder. At first, Jerry Quezada played the role of a grieving mother. She sobbed. She insisted it was a tragic accident. But when detectives pressed, the story began to unravel. She just fell. She was sick. She wasn't. Then why are there bruises all over her body? The evidence was undeniable. The bruises, the broken bones, the restraint marks. And when Quezada finally cracked, she didn't just confess, she turned on her boyfriend. Charles did it. He beat her. He wouldn't stop. She's lying. She's lying. The finger-pointing began, but it was too late. The truth had already been exposed, and the monsters behind closed doors were about to face justice. The crime had been committed. The child had taken her last breath, but the story was far from over. Because the moment Leiliana Wright's lifeless body was carried out of that house, a new battle began. A battle for truth, for justice, and for the answers no one wanted to hear. The crime scene was more than just a home. It was a silent witness, a vault of horrors waiting to be unlocked. And as the forensic team moved through each room, the truth began to reveal itself, piece by piece. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something terrible had happened. The air was thick, stifling, like the walls had absorbed the screams. And then, they found the blood. Not just from that day. Remember, this was old blood. Evidence of past violence. Evidence of a child who had been suffering long before that final beating. But it wasn't just blood. Investigators found something even more disturbing. Makeshift restraints. Leiliana had been tied up, restrained like an animal, and the autopsy would later reveal why. Ligature marks consistent with prolonged restraint, severe bruising in various stages of healing. She hadn't just been beaten that day. She had been beaten for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. The medical examiner's findings would confirm what the crime scene had already whispered. This was no accident. This was torture. Extensive blunt force trauma, internal bleeding, evidence of previous fractures, some healed, some still fresh. And the most horrifying detail? This wasn't the first time her tiny bones had been broken. This wasn't the first time she had suffered. Inside the Grand Prairie Police Department, Jerry Quezada was seated across from detectives. At first, she played the part, the grieving mother, the one who just didn't know what had happened. Tell us what happened, Jerry. I don't know. She just stopped breathing. But detectives had already seen the crime scene. They had already read the autopsy report. They weren't buying it. And then they played their ace. Then explain this. A photo of Leiliana's bruised, battered body, the truth staring Quezada in the face. And that was when the first crack appeared. It wasn't me. It was him. It was Charles. He wouldn't stop. And just like that, she flipped. She pointed the finger at the man sitting in another interrogation room. Charles Pfeiffer, the so-called father figure in Leiliana's life. You're telling us Charles did this? He tied her up? He beat her? Yes, he was mad. She wouldn't listen. He said she needed to be punished. Quezada was desperate to save herself. But the problem? Her story didn't quite add up. While Quezada crumbled, Charles Pfeiffer remained stone-faced. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't panicked. He was something worse. Controlled. "Jerry says you did it, Charles. That you beat Leiliana to death." "She's lying." Pfeiffer denied everything. He claimed he was barely involved, that Jerry was the real monster, that he was just a witness to a tragedy. But then, detectives played their second ace. Forensic evidence. Your DNA is on the weapon, your fingerprints, your blood. And in that moment, detectives knew they had their killers. Justice is supposed to be blind, but in this case, it had taken too long to open its eyes. Too long for a little girl who had already been silenced. Now the weight of the law would decide whether Charles Pfeiffer and Jerry Quezada would pay for what they had done. The prosecution did not mince words. They didn't just want a conviction, they wanted a statement. They wanted to make sure Charles Pfeiffer never walked free again. Evidence was stacked against him, and when the jury saw it, they had no doubts. These were not injuries caused by a single accident. These were repeated, deliberate acts of violence. But Pfeiffer's defense? It was flimsy, pathetic, a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. There is no concrete proof that Charles Pfeiffer inflicted these injuries. It's possible some of the wounds were self-inflicted. It's possible this was a tragic accident. But the jury wasn't buying it. How could a 4-year-old tie herself up? How could she give herself broken ribs? How could she cause her own fatal head trauma? It took the jury less than 2 hours, and when they returned, their message was clear. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of capital murder. Charles Pfeiffer would never see the outside world again. The judge handed down his sentence swiftly. Life without the possibility of parole. But if Charles Pfeiffer's conviction was swift, Jerry Quezada's fate was complicated, because instead of a trial, she took a different path, a plea deal. In exchange for her testimony against Charles Pfeiffer, Jerry Quezada will plead guilty to felony injury to a child. No murder charge, no life sentence, just a fraction of the punishment. She let it happen. She helped, and she gets a reduced sentence? Where is the justice? The public was furious. The jury had found Charles Pfeiffer guilty of murder, but many believed Quezada had been just as guilty, just as responsible. She could have saved her. She was her mother, and she did nothing. But this case wasn't just about two abusers. It was about an entire system that had failed to protect an innocent child. And now, that system was under fire. CPS was warned about this household multiple times. Reports were filed, concerns were raised, and yet Leiliana Wright was still sent back into the arms of her killers. Multiple warning signs, multiple reports, multiple chances to intervene, and yet, nothing. Why? Leiliana's death was a tragedy, but it sparked something bigger, a movement to change child protection laws. We failed her, but we will not fail the next child. Because at the heart of this case, beyond the trials, beyond the verdicts, beyond the outrage, was a little girl who deserved better. A little girl whose story should never be forgotten. In the aftermath of unspeakable tragedy, there are two choices: to let the pain consume us or to turn it into something greater. Leiliana Wright did not get to grow up, did not get to escape the horrors of her final days, but in death her story forced change. A little girl's suffering shook the foundation of a broken system, and from that brokenness came reform. The case of Leiliana Wright sent shockwaves through the state of Texas. The public demanded answers, and lawmakers could no longer ignore the cracks in the system. Within months, pressure mounted. Change had to happen. The failures in this case are staggering. We cannot allow another child to slip through the cracks. We owe Leiliana this reform. The Leiliana Wright Act wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about rewriting the way child protection worked in Texas. It forced those in power to answer a difficult question. If these changes had been in place earlier, would Leiliana still be alive? No more missed warning signs. Every child placed back in a home with a history of abuse would receive unannounced follow-ups. No longer could abusers escape their past by moving state to state. CPS now had full access to criminal records beyond Texas. Overburdened caseworkers had missed too many warning signs. The act reduced their caseloads, ensuring each case received the attention it deserved. These changes were not just laws on paper. They were safeguards, lifelines. a promise that no child should suffer like Leiliana did. For Elisa and Craig Clackley, the pain of losing their granddaughter never faded, but instead of drowning in grief, they became warriors for change. We begged CPS to save her. We begged them, and they didn't listen. So now we're making sure they have no choice but to listen to the next family. But Elisa and Craig didn't stop at legislation. They wanted real accountability. They wanted answers. We asked for the names of every CPS worker who ignored those reports. We demanded to know why nothing was done. Texas wasn't the only state watching. As the Leiliana Wright Act took effect, child protection agencies across the country were forced to ask, are we failing children the same way? Leiliana's case opened the nation's eyes. It showed us that this wasn't just a Texas problem. This was a national crisis. Every year on March 12th, Leiliana Wright's name is spoken, not in sorrow but in power. Her life has become a symbol, a reminder that silence is not an option. We are here today because Leiliana should be here today. But Leiliana's story isn't just about the past, it's about the future. And that future depends on us. If you suspect child abuse, report it. If you see a broken system, demand change. Be the voice that a child doesn't have. One phone call could save a life. Don't be afraid to make it. Leiliana Wright's story should never be forgotten. If her story moved you, if you believe in justice, if you want to make sure no other child suffers the same fate, help spread the message. Join us in exposing the truths behind these cases. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and together we can make sure Leiliana's fight was not in vain. Leiliana Wright was not the first child to suffer at the hands of those meant to protect her, and tragically, she was not the last. Every day across America, thousands of children endure the same horrors, hidden behind closed doors, lost in the failures of a system that was built to save them. But why does this keep happening? And what is being done to stop it? The numbers are staggering. Every year, over 3.5 million children are reported to Child Protective Services. An estimated 1,800 children die as a result of abuse and neglect. And for every child who dies, thousands more suffer in silence. We are failing these children. The warning signs are there, yet time and time again, the system is too slow or too broken to act in time. Abuse doesn't just happen, it spreads. Like a disease, it infects families, passing down from one generation to the next. A child raised in violence is far more likely to become an abuser or a victim in adulthood. But why? The brain is shaped by experience. For a child raised in trauma, their brain is wired for survival, constantly in fight or flight mode. This affects emotional regulation, trust, and relationships well into adulthood. With so many cases slipping through the cracks, experts are turning to technology for answers. Could artificial intelligence help prevent the next tragedy? But technology alone won't solve the crisis. The fight against child abuse begins where children spend the most time, at school and in their own communities. The greatest weapon against child abuse is awareness. The signs are there, if you know where to look. If you see these signs, don't stay silent. Call your local child protection agency. Report it. You might be the only voice the child has. Child abuse is not just a family issue. It's a crisis that affects us all. But change starts with awareness. If we learn, if we act, if we refuse to look away, then maybe, just maybe, we can prevent the next tragedy. Help us shine a light on these stories. Help us give a voice to the children who no longer have one. Beyond the headline, beyond the courtroom, beyond the tragedy, there was a little girl who danced barefoot in the grass, who dreamed of being an artist, who laughed at silly jokes, and who had a light in her eyes that should have never been dimmed. Leiliana Wright was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a friend. She was a child with dreams, with potential, with a future that should have stretched far beyond her 4 short years. From the moment she could hold a crayon, Leiliana was drawing. Her tiny fingers would grip the colors tightly, filling blank pages with rainbows, animals, and stick figure families. To her, art wasn't just play, it was an escape, a way to bring joy into a world she didn't always understand. She would spend hours coloring. If you gave her a piece of paper and some crayons, she'd be in her own little world. I still have one of her drawings. I can't bring myself to throw it away. Despite the hardships at home, Leiliana found happiness in the little things. Playing with dolls, running barefoot outside, laughing at cartoons. To those who knew her, she wasn't just another child in the system. She was special. She used to run around with the kids outside, always laughing. She had this energy, this light about her. If she liked you, she'd grab your hand and take you on an adventure, even if it was just around the yard. Though her life was short, Leiliana's legacy lives on. In the years since her passing, her story has sparked something powerful. A movement, a mission to ensure that no child suffers the way she did. We wanted something beautiful to come from something so tragic. Leiliana loved to draw, so we created an art program in her name. If even one child finds hope through art the way she did, then her spirit lives on. Leiliana's story did more than break hearts. It ignited change. Parents, teachers, lawmakers, they all asked the same question. How do we stop this from happening again? Leiliana Wright should be here today. She should be painting, playing, laughing. But while we can't change the past, we can change the future. If you see something, say something. If a child is in danger, speak up. One phone call could save a life. Leiliana Wright's story should never have happened. No child should endure what she did. No child should suffer in silence while the world looks away. But we have the power to make sure it never happens again. Child abuse thrives in silence, and silence is deadly. If you see something, say something. If something feels wrong, it probably is. One phone call can save a life. So many people think, it's not my business. But if you're the only one who notices the signs and you say nothing, what happens then? Some stories end in tragedy, but some stories continue to grow long after a life is taken. And today, Leiliana's story is saving lives. You can be the difference between a life lost and a life saved. Help spread awareness and keep these stories alive.